Derrida's lecture, Qu'est-ce, qu'une traduction relevante? What is a relevant translation? Was given in French as a keynote speech. Sorry, I can't move my slide on. There we are. At the annual conference of Atlas, the Association for the Promotion of Literary Translation, in November 1998. It was published in French in the conference proceedings the following year. It appears to have made its way into Anglophone translation studies via Lawrence Venuti's English translation of the lecture, which was published in the Cultural Studies journal Critical Enquiry in 2001, and it was subsequently incorporated into the second and third editions of the Translation Studies Reader, and that was 2004 and 2012. Now, it was its presence in the Translation Studies Reader that's arguably resulted in its canonization as a key text in Anglophone translation studies. Many a master's student in the UK, if not further afield, finds themselves required to read it, sometimes to their own bemusement. Derrida's lecture is a strange centaur-like beast. While the original forum in which the lecture was delivered and its presence in the Translation Studies Reader have together created a paratext that suggests that Derrida's lecture is essentially about translation, a large portion of the lecture seems to be about something else: a Shakespeare play, Judaism and Christianity, mercy, forgiveness, and perjury. In this lecture, I'm exploring the possibility that Derrida's lecture is not, in fact, primarily about translation at all, but about that something else. And I want to problematize existing readings in translation studies by setting the lecture in the context of Derrida's other work of the same period. At the same time, though, I'm going to argue that Derrida's lecture nevertheless holds interest for us, albeit not for the reasons that are usually supposed. When Venuti translated Derrida's lecture and published it in Critical Enquiry, he wrote an introduction to go with that translation. And you can see in the summary of that introduction, if you just look at the bit that I've put the circle around, Venuti writes, "This lecture can be considered Derrida's most direct intervention to date into that fledgling discipline that in Europe and elsewhere is known as translation studies." So this is Venuti writing in 2001. And from his introduction, we don't necessarily have to read all of this, but if you just look for the proper names in here, we can see Venuti is essentially contextualizing Derrida's lecture in what was becoming at that time the canon of translation studies. So he talks about Friedrich Schleiermacher, who took up the idea of relevant translation. And then he talks about Eugène Nieder in the 20th century, when relevance came to dominate translation theory and practice. And then if you look at the final sentence of this quote, he says, "More recently, the branch of linguistics known as pragmatics has spawned an approach wherein the relevant translation communicates an interpretation of the foreign text through, quote, adequate contextual effects that take into account the receptor's cognitive environment and therefore require minimal processing effort." So Venuti is firmly inscribing Derrida's lecture in the tradition that at that time is growing up to be the tradition of translation studies, of Anglophone translation studies in any case. And what Venuti is referring to there in that final sentence are these publications. So a publication in Pragmatics called Relevance, Communication and Cognition that came out in 1986. And then the work of Ernst August Gut, who took that theory and explored how well it could explain translation activity. Relevance theory, just very, very briefly for those who don't know, is an attempt to explain how human communication happens and succeeds, particularly when there's actually so much that is left unsaid in communication. It's interested in, daily communication. And Ernst Gut, when he comes along, actually for his PhD thesis, which he did at UCL, he's looking to see how relevant relevance theory might be to translation. And he actually concludes that we don't need translation theory at all, because relevance theory can explain our translation decisions and our translation activity. So all those terms that Venuti is using, adequate contextual effects, cognitive environment, processing effort, those are all taken from relevance theory. Kathleen Davis's book in 2001, Deconstruction and Translation, does pretty much exactly the same thing. So when she talks about this lecture by Derrida, she says it coincides with the claims of contemporary relevance theory. And then she also uses the language of Ernst August Gut, most relevant, optimal relevance. She talks about contextual effects and minimal processing costs. So she quotes Gut there. So essentially she's taking Derrida's argument, or one argument from the lecture, and saying, okay, this is how this connects to relevance theory. So, sorry, before I go on to that slide, it's very striking how Davis and Venuti, and also another critic, Ertl, how they inscribe Derrida's lecture within a very specific lineage of translation studies theorists. So we've got Venuti, as we've seen, connecting to Schleiermacher, to Nida, and to Gut, but he also, in that same introduction, mentions Cicero, Jerome, Antoine Berman, and Philip Lewis. And in a later lecture, a later paper, he also mentions Henri Mechanique. So he's putting Derrida really into that lineage of people who are thinking about translation. Now, although Derrida himself, it's worth pointing out, he does not mention at any point in the lecture, he does not mention relevance theory or Gut or Nida, or indeed any of these theorists. So nevertheless, even though Derrida doesn't mention them, we can actually see why Venuti and others do. And we could argue that those readings by Venuti and Davis are what we might call responsible responses to Derrida's lecture. Because although Derrida says in the opening of the lecture that he's not going to talk about translation with a capital T, so traduction with a capital T, that is on a general or speculative level, he actually does devote the first 7 pages to doing precisely that. So he uses an apparently self-contradictory statement, nothing is translatable, and by the same token, nothing is untranslatable, as a springboard for what he calls the economy of translation that's governed by laws of property and quantity. So if you've read the lecture, you will have encountered that bit. So that theoretical discussion is there, and it's extended by the analogy that Derrida then sets up later in the lecture between Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice and translation itself. And Derrida himself says in the lecture, as if the subject of this play were, in short, the task of the translator, his impossible task, his duty, his debt, as inflexible as it is unpayable. So it's perfectly feasible to read Derrida's lecture as being about translation on a general level. However, I don't find it to be a particularly interesting reading. For what Derrida's talking about in that first 7 pages are what Matthew Reynolds has termed translation rigidly conceived. In other words, translation in the traditional sense, and what Derrida calls the rigorous sense, conferred on it over several centuries by a long and complex history in a given cultural situation. So this is what we might call conventional views of translation. This is a conventional view that insists on singularity, on replacing a word in one language with a word in another one. There is a different view of translation, and I think this comes out quite nicely in an earlier piece by Derrida called La main de Heidegger, Heidegger's hand, right? And this is where he says, in this piece, he says, I find myself obliged to move away from the published translation on occasion. But this is never with a view to evaluating or still less improving it. Instead, we should multiply suggestions, harry or hassle, harry the German word, and analyze it with many waves of touches, caresses, or blows. A translation in the conventional sense of what is published as a translation cannot do this. But we have a duty to do this each time the calculation of word for word, of one word for another, That is, the conventional ideal of translation finds itself challenged. So in that little quote, Derrida's setting up different kinds of translation. There's the conventional one, that is what a published translation is. In other words, you are replacing a word in the original language with a word or series of words in the target language in a very limited way. You're not replacing one word with 3 pages of words, for example. But there's this other way of translating, which is harrying or harassing the original word, analyzing it with many waves of touches, caresses, or blows. Now, this second kind is, in my view, of much greater interest to translation studies scholars today than those discussions of the traditional paradigm of translation, which are not particularly new or exciting. And I'm going to do my reading of Derrida's lecture based on that claim that I've just made, that it's this other kind of translation that's more interesting to us. So before I give my reading of Derrida's lecture, I want to talk about the chronological context of Derrida's lecture. So the existing readings that I've just mentioned give minimal weight to that chronological context. So they tend to read that 1998 lecture either in isolation from Derrida's other works or in conjunction with other pieces in which Derrida reflects explicitly on translation. And at most, the readings make passing mention of the key theoretical issues with which Derrida was preoccupied at the time. So Venuti, for example, says that the commentary on Merchant of Venice, that's part of Derrida's lecture, derives, and I'm quoting from Venuti, derives from a seminar on forgiveness and perjury, which Derrida taught earlier in 1998. Now, in an Anglo-American context, that statement risks understating quite considerably the extent to which Derrida was at the time immersed in this topic. So a seminar, in the French sense of the word, is something that is delivered over several years often, or at least over one academic year. So a seminar, yes, it's true that Derrida was working was delivering a seminar, but it's a seminar, and if you can see this book, that resulted in 2 books of this length. So this is the first year of the seminar, 1977 to 1998. There's a second volume, 1998 to 1999, and they're both extremely long. So the seminar that Venuti is referring to is not what we'd think of in Anglophone context as a seminar, like a 1-hour seminar, is actually a 2-year seminar that has since been published in a total of 800 pages. And as we'll see in a moment, rather than being derived from this seminar, Derrida's 1998 lecture was actually copied verbatim from it. And that fact is strongly relevant to my proposed reading. But if we just stay for now with the chronological context of Derrida's publications, we can see that his interest in the topic of forgiveness was extensive and deep. So we've got that 2-year seminar on perjury and pardon that I've just mentioned. That seminar was itself part of a longer seminar series called Questions or Issues of Responsibility, where Derrida was talking about such things as bearing witness, hospitality, the death penalty. The period around 1998 was also a time when Derrida was giving papers at 3 different conferences, a linked series of conferences on religion and postmodernism. And in that period, immediately following the lecture, he published 4 pieces on forgiveness, all of which were derived from that seminar that he was giving in Paris. So it's my contention that our most fruitful reading of the 1998 lecture is when we see it as being part of what Derrida terms the unending analysis of forgiveness, mercy, perjury, pardon, those things, rather than reading it as being about translation per se. So I mentioned that I had a sort of suspicion that Derrida's 1998 lecture was maybe composed of two different sections. When I first read it, it didn't seem to hang together particularly well for me. And in fact, if you look at the seminar that's now been published, we can see that the entire commentary of on the Merchant of Venice, which is about 2/3 of the 1998 lecture, is copied verbatim from the typescript of the second seminar that he gave as part of that seminar series. And what Derrida does is he makes a few very minor tweaks to the material. So, for example, he adjusts references to real life events so that the material is not out of date. He takes out references to any other sessions within the seminar. He takes out references to activities that the students should complete. But crucially, he also inserts a number of brief statements that connect the reading of Shakespeare, the commentary on Shakespeare, to the topic of translation. Those connections are not there in the original seminar material in any way. There is no connection between his reading of The Merchant of Venice and translation in the original seminar. There is no analogy with translation in the original seminar. So I'm just going to show you, I've put, don't bother trying to read all of this, but I've just put in bold the additions that Derrida makes when he takes that piece that he's already written and delivered at the seminar, and he brings that into the lecture that he's delivering as a keynote speech to the translators. So you can see that he's just inserting some really very small bits mentioning translation. So another problem of translation, which is not unrelated to the impossible possible of translation, but it also says something about the essence of translation. So he's inserting these tiny little bits without elaborating on them. So when we read the 1998 lecture side by side with the seminar from Le Parjure et le Pardon, we see that originally the commentary on Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice was not composed with a view to illuminating translation. It was conceived as a means of opening up a discussion of forgiveness, opening up in particular the system of gratitude, exchange, redemption, expiation, in which forgiveness is inscribed in Derrida's words. The analogies that Derrida inserts between forgiveness and translation appear as fleeting, unexplored additions to what is otherwise a very carefully elaborated commentary. So in my introduction, I referred to Derrida's lecture as a centaur-like beast. And what the comparison between the lecture and this book reveals is that it is indeed composed genetically of two distinct elements. You've got on the one hand the opening and the closing sections in which Derrida discusses translation on the general level. And then you've got the large central section, which is basically a commentary on the topic of forgiveness. And the two elements are sandwiched together, as it were, by a provocative, but in my view, relatively underdeveloped analogy. Now, why am I mentioning this? I'm not wanting to diminish the value of the lecture as a whole. I'm not wanting to say there's anything wrong with academic recycling, which a busy lecturer like Derrida undoubtedly had to do. This was, after all, his own unpublished work at the time. I also don't want to question the importance of work that has been done by Davis and also by Lisa Foran, amongst others, to develop the theoretical implications of the analogy that Derrida has perhaps casually thrown together. But the reason I'm mentioning it is I want to argue that at the time that Derrida gave this lecture to the Translators Association, he wasn't focusing on translation as a theoretical or philosophical problem. He was focusing on forgiveness. That was what was at the forefront of his mind at the time. And I think there's a strong case for conceiving of the lecture as one among many publications that deal with mercy and forgiveness rather than taking it to be about translation. So rather than paying attention to the title of the lecture, we should pay attention to its epigraphs, to those little quotations that precede the lecture, which are, "Then must the Jew be merciful. And Portier will also say, when mercy seasons justice. Of course, Derrida does mention translation in connection with those citations. The first one he says, I leave untranslated. And the second one he says, I shall later propose to translate. And we come back to that in a moment. So if we're not going to read this as a lecture about translation, does it have anything to offer translation studies? In my view, it does. And the key to that is in taking seriously Derrida's claim at the beginning of the lecture that the lecture is not about translation, but about the word in the body of its idiomatic singularity. And this is what Derrida says. Speaking, teaching, writing, which I also consider my profession, and which, like many here among you, engages me body and soul almost constantly. I know that these activities are meaningful in my eyes only in the proof of translation, through an experience that I will never distinguish from experimentation. As for the word will be my theme, I can say that if I love the word, it is only in the body of its idiomatic singularity, that is, where a passion for translation comes to lick it as a flame or an amorous tongue might. Derrida's reference to the word as a body, in French it's corps, carries on a long history of conceiving of texts as living organisms. In such a conceptualization, each reading of a text, each decision in each reading is a cutting trace in the text. But like an organism, Derrida says, the text regenerates its own tissue indefinitely after each such incision, retaining its secrecy and its ability to surprise. So in this citation that I've just given, translation emerges as one such form of readerly decision-making. It licks like a flame or a loving tongue at the body of the text. And there's a strong echo of the passage that I cited from La Main de Heidegger, where Derrida speaks of harrying or harassing the German word and subjecting it to successive waves of touch, caress, or, like flames that threaten to destroy, blows. So we've got this sense of danger, of unrelenting focus and potential danger. Derrida refers to this as a prowling, and he uses that word, which in French is rôder, a prowling around a word. So it's danger that is, however, not carried out through to consummation or destruction. Now, it's not just any word that Derrida's interested in prowling around in this experimental way. Rather, it's the words that Hélène Cixous terms symptom words, cleft words that beetle over their base, clefts through which world commotions are produced. These are words which make possible the poetic practice of the philosophical. They are powerful, piercing words capable of shaking a wall of repression. Typically, these words are homophonic, so they contain some kind of multiplicity within their apparent singularity, and they function to open, to unenclose, to destabilize. They are often considered untranslatable in the sense that you can't usually have that same multiplicity within one word in one language as you do in another language. It's clear though, and I'm not sure that Derrida himself says this, but it's clear when you read Derrida that that multiplicity can itself be interlingual. So for example, in this seminar, Derrida plays with the French word merci, M-E-R-C-I, just simply meaning thank you, and explains that he hears the English word mercy within it. So for him, merci is homophonic because he also hears the English word mercy. He does the same thing with pardon, pardon in the seminar. So these words are words that in Sisu's terms are powerful, they're piercing, they can do something, they can shake something up. And in the 1998 lecture, Derrida identifies relevant, relevant, as being one of these words. And it's the word, that is the word around which he's prowling in this lecture, the French word relevant, which, as you'll know, is in the title of the lecture, Qu'est-ce, qu'une traduction relevante. And Derrida says in that lecture, you don't know which language I'm speaking in my title. So in other words, you don't know whether I'm saying the French word relevant or the English word relevant, okay? And in the readings done by Venuti and others, we've been very quick to assume that Derrida means the English word relevant. But what I'm going to be arguing now is that actually it's the French word relevant, but it's a word that is also a word in translation. So this is the next quote from Derrida in the lecture. He says, this word relevant carries in its body an ongoing process of translation. As a translative body, it endures or exhibits translation as the memory or stigmata of suffering, or hovering above it as an aura or halo. So Derrida is referring to relevant, or relevant, as a body, a word that is in an ongoing process of translation and that carries a memory of translation. So let me explain that. The French word relevant, it means something, it doesn't mean relevant, okay? So if we wanted to say relevant, you know, the English word relevant in French, if we wanted to put that in French, we would say something like pertinent, applicable, d'actualité, être en rapport avec quelque chose, avoir à voir avec, etc. So we wouldn't say relevant if we wanted to translate the English word relevant. If we see the word relevant in French, if we just saw that sort of on its own, we would assume it's a present participle of the verb relever. Okay, so it's doing the action of relever, and relever is one of these words that means a whole host of things. So these are just some of the meanings: pick up, lift up, raise, rebuild, restore, increase, season, enhance, take over from, react, take in, release. It's one of those words that if you look it up in a corpus-based dictionary, you'll get a good page worth of examples. But in some French, for example, Belgian French, the English word relevant, meaning relevant, has been borrowed into French. So in Belgian French, you do have the adjective relevant, meaning relevant in the English sense. And Derrida, when he says that relevant is carrying an ongoing process of translation in it, he's referring to that ongoing Frenchification of the English word. In other words, the borrowing of that word, relevant, the adjective, into French. A bit like, you know, le weekend or something, which has been borrowed into French. What's more interesting to us, though, is this second way in which relevant is a translative body. And Derrida says it endures or exhibits translation as the memory or stigmata. So it's got a memory of a translation event that happened in the past. And Derrida is clear in the lecture about what that is. It's a translation event that he created. So he, back in 1967-68, he translated the German word aufheben as relever. And that is the memory of translation that the word relevant carries, according to Derrida. And this is what he says in the lecture in 1967, to translate a crucial German word with a double meaning, so one of these powerful words, aufheben or Aufhebung, the noun, a word that signifies at once to suppress and to elevate, so it signifies both those things within that same word, a word that Hegel says represents the speculative risk of the German language and that the entire world had until then agreed was untranslatable, or if you prefer, a word for which no one had agreed with anyone on a stable, satisfying translation into any language. For this word, I had proposed the noun relève and the verb relever. This allowed me to retain, joining them in a single word, the double motif of the elevation and the replacement that preserves what it denies or destroys, preserving what it causes to disappear. So Derrida was delighted with this translation back in the 60s, okay? And he refers to it in this lecture, in the 1998 lecture, as an incalculable stroke of luck. So he sees that as a very successful translation. And for him and for other people, because that translation became institutionalized, it became the French word for talking about the German Aufhebung, for talking about Hegel's idea of Aufhebung. It became institutionalized. So for him, for Derrida, and for all these other people who encountered it in those institutional contexts, you cannot see, you cannot hear, you cannot read relève or relever or any of the derivations from it, including relevant, without having that memory or stigmata or halo of that translation. So in other words, that French word now kind of has that German word and that whole philosophical tradition of Hegel within it, right? It's got that memory of it on its body, its sort of physical body, as it were. So what Derrida does in this lecture in 1998 is he uses the word and prowling around that word, relever, relève, to understand more about mercy and forgiveness. And that's what I'm going to try and do in the final bit of time that I have, is just look at how Derrida uses the word relève, the translative body, the memory of translation, to deepen understanding of mercy and forgiveness. So the question for me, for when we come to Derrida's lecture, is not, what does this lecture have to tell us about the concept of relevance as it relates to translation, which is how people have read it in the past, but how does this prowling around this little group of French words deepen our understanding of mercy? So how can we use translation to understand something else? And in the process, we might understand something about translation as we do that. So I'm not interested in the title, as I've said, I'm interested in the epigraphs. Before I look at the way that Derrida uses this, does this prowling, I'm going to give you a very, very, very potted summary of Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice, just in case you don't know what it's about and you haven't had time to read Derrida's lecture. So very, very simply, we have a merchant called Antonio who borrows money from Shylock, a Jewish moneylender. Now, instead of lending the money and charging interest, Shylock says, instead of interest, if you don't pay it back within 3 months, I will get a pound of your flesh, right? I'll get a pound of your flesh. And Antonio agrees. Well, then, predictably, of course, Antonio's ships are all lost at sea, so we think anyway, and he goes bankrupt. So he can't pay back the money that he owes, and the case goes to court. And Shylock says, I want my pound of flesh. Now, the lawyer, who is actually a woman dressed up as a man, Portia, she's actually Antonio's friend's wife-to-be. She's pretending to be a lawyer. She asks Shylock to be merciful, which in fact she tells him he's going to have to be merciful. There is the offer of money from Portia, doesn't really matter. He's being offered money that he can take instead of the pound of flesh. So the court is trying to persuade him, don't ask for the pound of flesh, take the money instead. And Portia, this lawyer, pretending to be a lawyer, says, you know, you must be merciful. Shylock says, no, not. I want the pound of flesh. Portia says, okay, you know, there was a bond, Antonio's broken it, you're entitled to your pound of flesh. Great. But then she says, you're not entitled to a single drop of blood with that pound of flesh. You're entitled to a pound of flesh because that was in the bond, but the bond is not for a single drop of blood. So you have to take the flesh without spilling any of Antonio's blood, which of course, if you're going to cut off a bit of someone's flesh, you're going to make them bleed. So that's not possible. So Shylock realizes at that point, okay, you know, he's been defeated. He says, okay, all right, I'll take the money instead. Portia says, well, actually, no, you've threatened the life of a Venetian, so you're not going to get anything. And also, Shylock is forced to convert to Christianity from Judaism. So things don't end well for Shylock. Things end pretty well for everyone else. So Derrida is giving a reading, a commentary on Shakespeare's play. He's giving a reading of it. He's interested in what this play tells us about mercy, about forgiveness, okay? And he reads the play several times, which is very characteristic for Derrida. So he presents the first reading over about 7 pages of the lecture, where he contrasts the divine grandeur of forgiveness with the cynical human calculations that hide behind it. So this is Shylock's perspective. He's being, you know, they're appealing to him to display mercy, and that's, you know, very sort of grand and divine thing. But actually what they really want is they basically want to, you know, have one up on him and come out on top. So there are cynical human calculations hiding behind all this discourse of mercy. Derrida then presents a second reading, which is an expanded paraphrase of 14 lines from a very famous monologue that Portia makes about the virtues of mercy, the amazing powers of mercy. And then Derrida presents a third reading based on a single line from Portia's monologue. And that's the one that's in the epigraphs. So let me just look at Portia's monograph. Okay, so monologue, not monograph, sorry, I'm a bit tired. So Portia, this is in the court case. Portia says, do you confess the bond to Antonio? In other words, did you agree to this? Antonio says, yes, I did. Portia, then must the Jew be merciful? Shylock, on what compulsion must I? Tell me that. And then this is Portia's answer, why he should be merciful. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. And earthly power doth then show like as God's when mercy seasons justice. Derrida stops the quote there, and he embarks on this third reading of what's happening of justice and mercy in this play. But let's just read on in the monologue, just for now. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. Okay, so Portia there in that final bit is saying, you know, if we all insist on justice, then we're all lost. Under the Christian worldview, we're all lost because nobody can ever be just before God. We all rely on mercy for salvation, so we should show mercy to others. Now, as I've said, Derrida opens up his third reading with this line, when mercy seasons justice. And he says, this is what he's proposing to translate with the verb relève. Okay, when mercy seasons justice. So he's going to translate the word seasons with relève. And this opens up new avenues for his commentary. It's significant that when Derrida introduces this translation, he says, I shall therefore translate, and he takes responsibility through that for the translation and the three gestures, as he calls them, that it allows him to attempt. So I'm going to look at these gestures, and I'm going to therefore explore the value that the translative body, relève, brings to the reading of mercy and forgiveness. So Derrida explores this. He says there are three gestures. Firstly, mercy seasons in the sense of intensifying the flavor of justice. Secondly, mercy elevates justice. And thirdly, mercy destroys and preserves justice. So this is all about understanding how mercy and justice connect with each other. And Derrida is exploring this connection using the word relève to do that. So the first gesture is premised on the culinary connotations of the verb relever, which has one of its meanings in French as being to season, in the sense of seasoning a dish. Okay, so Derrida explains this, says that if you season a dish, then you give the dish still more of its own taste, its own natural flavor. So, you know, you've probably all done quite a bit of cooking. And if we want something to just taste of itself a bit more strongly, we would season the dish. We would put in salt usually, right? And this is what Derrida is saying. So we put in seasoning to make the dish taste of itself more intensely, not to make it taste of something else. So he says, this is precisely what Portier says. Mercy seasons justice. The quality of mercy seasons the taste of justice. Mercy keeps the taste of justice while affecting it, refining it, cultivating it. Now, this is really interesting because I can't find that in Portier's monologue at all. If we look back to what Portier says, particularly in the lines after mercy seasons justice, it is much more about needing the harshness of justice to be tempered by mercy. You know, if we don't have mercy, then we're all damned, we're all lost. So it's not so much about justice becoming more tasting of justice. It's actually about moderating or alleviating or tempering justice rather than intensifying it. And that is a sense of the word season that actually would have been current, the most current meaning in Shakespeare's day. And interestingly, when François Victor Hugo translates this, he actually says, "Quand le pardon tempère la justice." So Derrida is reading this seasons in a different way. He's reading it as an intensification of justice. And that reading is coming from knowing the word relever in French and its use in French in connection with cooking. Okay, so it's a translative body that's bringing that reading. It's not obviously there through the English mercy seasons justice. The second meaning that Derrida brings, he says, mercy elevates justice. Now, in Portier's monologue, if we read it slowly and carefully, she seems to be saying that earthly power, as it's invested in the monarch, takes on divine qualities when justice is moderated by mercy. But in Derrida's reading, it's justice itself that is sublimated when combined with mercy. So Derrida says mercy elevates justice, it pulls and inspires justice towards highness. Thanks to forgiveness, thanks to mercy, justice is even more just, it transcends itself. So mercy elevates justice. But Portier's monologue is saying that mercy actually gives divine qualities to the person who's exercising justice, to the king, to the monarch. And it is important to note that the English word seasons doesn't carry the sense of elevation in any of its uses, whether in Shakespeare's era or our own. So to release that meaning of mercy elevating justice, you need the French word relever, because relever does have that meaning of elevation. Now, finally, Derrida says that mercy destroys and preserves justice. This is the third gesture. And this is where he brings in that memory of translation, that scar, that halo of translation that connects relevé to Hegel. And Derrida says such a relève, right, a dialectical movement of interiorization, interiorizing memory and sublimating spiritualization, such a relève is precisely at issue here in Portier's mouth. Mercy relève, it elevates, replaces, and interiorizes the justice that it seasons. Once again, that would not be readily derivable from the English word used by Portier or the context of the monologue in which it occurs. So it's that translative halo, that memory of the translation of Aufheben that allows Derrida to make this connection. Now, what's quite interesting in Le Parjure et le Pardon, where Derrida first has this commentary, that becomes a means of anticipating a much more detailed engagement with Hegel's conceptualization of forgiveness and reconciliation. But obviously in the 1998 lecture, he just kind of leaves it hanging. So all of these gestures that Derrida attempts are only possible because he's taking seasons, the English word, when mercy seasons justice, as the French word relève, relever, with all that carries, its multiple meanings and its memory of a past translation. Okay, so conclusions. At the end of his lecture, Derrida, so he takes us through all of this, and then he says, I'm not sure that this, what he's just been doing with relevé, with that translative body, I'm not sure that this merits the name of translation. It rather seems one of those other things in tr, a transaction, transformation, travail, travel, and a treasure trove, in French it's trouvaille. Since this invention consisted only in discovering what was waiting or in waking what was sleeping in the language. So what Derrida's doing with relève is an invention, but it's one that was kind of lying there waiting to be discovered. If we now turn to the title of the lecture, Derrida has it as a question. What is a translation relevante? Qu'est-ce qu'une traduction relevante? And if we take that relevante to be the translative body relevé rather than the English word relevant, what does this mean? How do we answer that question ourselves? What is a translation relevante? Well, we can carry out those same three gestures that Derrida carries out on the commentary. We can carry those out on this question. So we could say, or we could ask, is a translation that is relevant, is it one which intensifies the properties of the original, that seasons them in that sense? Or is it one that elevates the original to a higher level of some kind? Or is it one which preserves what it denies or destroys, preserving what it causes to disappear? I think that with translation, that one we can quite easily see how that could apply. A translation preserves what it denies or destroys, what it causes to disappear. But I leave those all as questions because it's never good to have too many definitive answers when we're dealing with Derrida. Thank you very much.